Be glad we even let you visit, my daughter said as she stood in the doorway of the house I had helped pay for. My son didn't say a word. He just looked away. I stood there holding a small paper bag filled with homemade cookies for my grandchildren. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard her. Then she folded her arms and sighed. Mom, we're busy people. The kids have schedules. We have schedules. You can't just show up whenever you want. I looked past her shoulder. Inside, I could see my grandchildren laughing in the living room. I could hear the television. I could smell dinner cooking. My family was only 20 feet away. Yet somehow I felt farther from them than ever before. I smiled. Not because I was happy, because at 72 years old, I had learned that sometimes dignity means refusing to argue with people who have already made up their minds about your worth. So I handed the bag to my daughter. Tell the kids Grandma loves them. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. I didn't cry. Not then. The tears came later. The next morning, I sat across from an attorney and began making decisions that would change all of our lives forever. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. The drive home that evening felt longer than usual. The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. Normally, I loved that time of day. My late husband, Harold, used to call it God's hour. He would sit on our front porch with a glass of iced tea and watch the sky change colors. Sometimes we'd sit there for an hour without saying a single word. After 46 years of marriage, silence had become its own language. Harold had been gone for 6 years. A heart attack. Quick and unexpected. One ordinary Tuesday morning he kissed me goodbye before leaving for the hardware store. By lunchtime he was gone. People always tell you that time heals grief. I don't know if that's true. Time teaches you how to carry grief. That's different. You learn how to wake up every morning without the person who knew your entire life story. You learn how to eat dinner alone. How to fold one set of laundry instead of two. How to sleep on only one side of a king-sized bed. The ache never completely disappears. You simply learn to make room for it. After Harold passed away, I devoted myself to my children and grandchildren. At least I thought I did. Every birthday card. Every Christmas gift. Every school fundraiser. Every soccer game. Every dance recital. If they needed help, I was there. When my son Brian lost his job during the recession, I quietly covered 3 months of his mortgage payments. When my daughter Lisa went through her divorce, she lived with me for nearly a year. I never asked for anything in return. That's what parents do. Or at least that's what I believed. The strange thing is that disrespect rarely arrives all at once. It's gradual. Like water dripping onto stone. One drop at a time. First you barely notice. A forgotten phone call. A canceled lunch. An unanswered text message. Then one day you look around and realize the relationship you thought you had no longer exists. Looking back, I can see the signs now. Birthday invitations arriving after the event had already happened. Family photos posted online from gatherings I didn't know about. Holiday plans discussed without including me. Little things. Always little things. Small enough that confronting them would make me seem sensitive. Small enough that I kept making excuses. They're busy. The kids have activities. Life gets complicated. I repeated those explanations for years. The truth was harder to accept. I was slowly becoming an afterthought. That evening after returning home, I carried my purse into the kitchen and placed it on the counter. The house felt unusually quiet. Not lonely, just honest. Unlike the house I just left. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table Harold had built with his own hands almost 30 years earlier. The wood was worn smooth from decades of family dinners. Thousands of conversations. Thousands of memories. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and stared out the window into the darkness. My daughter's words kept replaying in my head. Be glad. We even let you visit. Not welcome. Not loved. Not appreciated. Aloud. As if I were a stranger asking for a favor. As if I hadn't spent decades sacrificing for the very people now treating me like an inconvenience. That's when something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. For the first time in years, I stopped asking what I had done wrong. Instead, I started asking a different question. What happens when people become so comfortable with your generosity that they mistake it for weakness? The answer would come sooner than any of them expected. And when it did, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. The next morning, I woke up at 5:45 a.m. Old habits are hard to break. For 46 years, that had been the time Harold and I started our day. Even after 6 years alone, my body still followed the same routine. I walked into the kitchen and automatically reached for 2 coffee mugs before stopping myself. I smiled sadly and put one back. Some lessons grief never stops teaching. The coffee maker hummed softly while dawn slowly brightened the backyard. Outside, a light spring rain covered the grass with tiny drops that sparkled under the porch light. The house was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that reminds you how much is missing. I carried my coffee to the dining room and sat at the same chair I had occupied every morning for decades. Across from me sat Harold's empty chair. Nobody had used it since the day he died. The wood had faded slightly compared to the others. Sometimes I thought about moving it. Sometimes I thought about putting it away. But I never could. Leaving it there somehow felt right. Like I was protecting a small piece of our life together. I looked around the room. The grandfather clock. The china cabinet. The framed family photos. Every object carried memories. There was a picture from Brian's high school graduation. Another from Lisa's wedding. A family vacation to Yellowstone National Park when the kids were teenagers. Back then, family seemed simple. We didn't have much money. Harold worked long hours at the manufacturing plant. I worked part-time at the library. We saved every dollar we could. We drove used cars, took modest vacations, clipped coupons, planned carefully. Everything we built took years. Nothing came easily. But there was love in that house. Real love. The kind that showed up every day. As I sipped my coffee, I found myself staring at a photograph taken nearly 20 years ago. Brian stood beside me with his arm around my shoulders. He couldn't have been older than 30. His smile was genuine. His eyes were warm. I remembered the day clearly. His company had gone through layoffs. He was terrified of losing his house. One evening he arrived at our front door looking exhausted. Harold and I invited him in. We sat at this very table. For 3 hours we talked through every option. By the end of the night, we had quietly decided to help him. Not because he asked. Because he was our son. Parents do those things. At least we did. I stood and walked into the living room. The morning news played softly in the background. I wasn't really watching. My mind kept drifting through old memories. The strange thing about getting older is that your life begins to feel like a collection of photographs. Moments frozen in time. People changing one picture at a time until one day you hardly recognize them. After Harold passed away, I tried very hard not to become a burden to anyone. I managed my own finances, maintained the house myself, handled repairs when I could, hired help when necessary. I never expected my children to take care of me. I only hoped they would want me around. There was a difference. A very big difference. First, they called often. Especially during the first year after Harold's death. Brian checked in every Sunday. Lisa visited twice a month. The grandchildren came over for dinner. The house felt alive again. But gradually things changed. The Sunday calls became every other week. Then once a month. Then only when something important came up. Visits became shorter. Less frequent. More rushed. Every conversation seemed squeezed between other priorities. We have a busy week. The kids have activities. We'll come by soon. Maybe next weekend. Always next weekend. Always later. I believed them. For years I believed them. Because believing the truth would have hurt too much. Then little things started happening. Family gatherings I learned about afterward. Birthday dinners I wasn't invited to. Photos on social media showing everyone together. Everyone except me. Whenever I asked about it, there was always an explanation. A misunderstanding. A scheduling issue. A last-minute decision. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make me question my own feelings. I kept telling myself not to be sensitive. Not to overreact. Not to make things uncomfortable. So I stayed quiet. And with every year, the distance grew a little wider. Until eventually I found myself standing outside my own daughter's front door being told I should be grateful simply for being allowed to visit. The words still hurt. Not because they were cruel, because they were honest. For the first time, someone had said out loud what their actions had been saying for years. I wasn't part of their lives anymore. I was an occasional guest. An obligation. A name on a birthday card. A phone number they called when it was convenient. As the rain continued outside, I looked around the house Harold and I had built together. For the first time in a long while, I stopped feeling sorry for myself. Instead, I started seeing things clearly. The problem wasn't that I was alone. The problem was that I had spent years holding on to relationships that my children had already let go of. And once that realization settled in, something inside me became very calm. Because clarity has a way of changing everything, even before a single decision is made. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing things I had ignored for years. It was as if a fog had finally lifted. Once you stop making excuses for people, certain truths become impossible to miss. The first thing I noticed was how often I was the last person to know anything. A week after my visit to Lisa's house, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw photos from my grandson Ethan's baseball tournament. There were dozens of pictures. Ethan holding a trophy, Brian cheering from the stands, Lisa and her family smiling together. Even my former sister-in-law was there. I stared at the photos for a long time. Not because I was upset about missing the game, because I hadn't even known it was happening. The post had been online for 2 days. Nobody had mentioned it. Nobody had called. Nobody had sent a text. I quietly set my phone down and looked out the kitchen window. Years ago, Ethan used to call me after every game. Win or lose. He'd tell me every detail. Every hit. Every strikeout. Every funny thing that happened afterward. Now I was learning about his life the same way strangers did. Through social media. A few days later, another small thing happened. The kind of thing that seems insignificant until you add it to 100 others. I called Brian on a Wednesday evening. His voicemail answered immediately. I left a message. Nothing urgent. I simply wanted to hear his voice. 3 days passed. No response. On Saturday afternoon, I saw pictures online of Brian and his family spending the day at a local lake. Apparently he had plenty of time. Just not for me. I wish I could tell you that these realizations made me angry. They didn't. They made me tired. There is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from being unwanted by people you spent your entire life loving. Not hated. Not mistreated openly. Simply unnecessary. That exhaustion settles deep inside your bones. One evening I opened a drawer in my living room and found a stack of birthday cards I had saved over the years. Harold used to tease me about keeping everything. Cards. Letters. School drawings. Old photographs. I sat on the couch and began flipping through them. Many were from the children when they were young. The handwriting changed as they grew older. The messages changed too. When Brian was 10, he wrote, "Mom, thank you for always helping me. You're the best mom ever." At 12, Lisa wrote, "I hope when I grow up I'm just like you." I ran my fingers over the faded ink. Back then they meant every word. I believe that. Children don't fake love. Life changes people. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes in ways they don't even notice themselves. The following Sunday brought another reminder. 4 years, Sunday had been family day. Harold started that tradition when the kids were little. Every Sunday evening, everyone gathered for dinner. No matter how busy life became. At least that was the rule. After Harold passed away, I kept the tradition alive for as long as possible. But eventually attendance became inconsistent. Then rare. Then non-existent. That Sunday, I decided to drive by the old family restaurant where we used to meet after church. I wasn't planning to go inside. I was simply passing through town. As I pulled into a nearby parking lot, I noticed something familiar. Brian's truck. Lisa's SUV. Several other family vehicles. My stomach tightened. I sat quietly inside my car. Families entered and exited the restaurant. Children laughed. People carried leftovers. Life continued. Then I saw them. My children. My grandchildren. The entire family gathered together. Without me. Again. Nobody had forgotten to invite me. Nobody had accidentally left me out. That explanation no longer worked. This time the truth stood right in front of me, clear as daylight. I stayed there for less than a minute before putting the car in reverse. As I drove away, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Pain loses some of its power once it stops surprising you. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The same table where Harold and I had helped with homework, balanced checkbooks, planned vacations, solved problems, built a life. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. The sound filled the silence. For years I had been asking myself the wrong question. Why don't they call? Why don't they visit? Why don't they include me? But sitting there that night, another question finally emerged. What exactly were they expecting from me? Because despite the distance, despite the neglect, one thing had remained remarkably consistent. Whenever money was involved, my phone always rang. A contribution for a school fundraiser, help with a down payment, assistance during a difficult month, support for a family project. Strangely enough, those invitations never stopped. The realization settled heavily over me. Perhaps I wasn't being excluded from the family. Perhaps I was being included only when I was useful. And for the first time I began to wonder if there was a reason my children suddenly became so attentive whenever conversations turned toward the future. Toward property, toward savings, toward inheritance. At the time, I didn't know how important that question would become. But I was about to find out. That night, after I began wondering about inheritance for the first time, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet. The rain from earlier had stopped. Only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock echoed through the hallway. At nearly midnight, I got up and walked into my study. The room hadn't changed much since Harold passed away. His old leather chair still sat beside the bookshelf. His reading lamp remained exactly where he left it. Even after 6 years, I couldn't bring myself to move certain things. Some people call that holding on to the past. I call it remembering. I sat at my desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were dozens of folders, tax records, insurance papers, old photographs, letters. 46 years of a life built together. Near the back was a worn brown envelope. Harold's handwriting covered the front. Seeing it always made me pause. His handwriting had been strong and neat, the kind of handwriting people don't seem to have anymore. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were letters he had written over the years, birthday notes, anniversary cards, small messages he would leave in my lunch bag when we were younger. Simple things, but meaningful. I smiled as I unfolded one of them. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. The letter wasn't long. Harold never wasted words. He had written it on our 40th wedding anniversary. One sentence caught my attention immediately. You've always been the heart of this family. I read those words several times. Then I sat quietly. Because lately I had started feeling like a visitor in the very family we spent decades creating. Harold never would have allowed that. Not because he was controlling. Because family mattered deeply to him. He believed respect was earned both ways. Parents respected their children. Children respected their parents. Nobody was above anyone else. When Brian and Lisa were growing up, Harold worked hard. Very hard. Most weeks he put in 50 or 60 hours at the manufacturing plant. Sometimes more. There were years when he left before sunrise and returned after dark. Yet somehow he never missed the important things. Little league games, school concerts, graduation ceremonies, family dinners. He made time. That was his gift. I often think people assume families simply happen. They don't. Families are built. One conversation at a time. One sacrifice at a time. One decision at a time. Harold understood that. We both did. As I sat there holding the letter, memories kept returning. I remembered the year Brian wanted to attend a summer engineering program in Chicago. The tuition was expensive. Far more than we could comfortably afford. Harold sold his fishing boat to make it happen. Brian never knew. We never told him. Parents don't keep score. At least we didn't. I remembered when Lisa dreamed of opening her own bakery. The business struggled during its first year. More than once, Harold quietly wrote checks to help cover expenses. Again, we never mentioned it. We weren't investing in businesses. We were investing in our children. That's what parents do. Or at least what we believe parents should do. Around 1 in the morning, I opened another folder. This one contained estate documents, trust papers, property records, financial statements. Harold had always been organized. Everything was labeled. Everything was updated. As I looked through the paperwork, I remembered a conversation we had during the final year of his life. Neither of us knew then how little time remained. We were sitting on the back porch one summer evening. The sun was setting, the same way it had thousands of times before. Harold was reviewing some financial documents. I teased him about spending retirement doing paperwork. He laughed. Then he became serious. "Promise me something," he said. I remember looking up from my iced tea. "What is it?" He tapped the folder in front of him. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel obligated because of money." At the time the comment seemed strange, almost random. I asked him what he meant. He looked toward the backyard. "The children should love you because you're their mother." He paused. "Not because of what's in these files." I remember laughing and telling him he worried too much. The kids loved us. Of course they did. There was no reason to think otherwise. Now, sitting alone years later, those words felt different. Much different. Almost as if he had seen something I hadn't. The clock struck 1:30. I closed the folders and leaned back in my chair. The room suddenly felt smaller. Not because of grief. Because of realization. For years I had focused on what my children were doing. Their behavior. Their distance. Their indifference. But I had never stopped to consider something else. What were they expecting to happen next? Harold and I had accumulated valuable assets over nearly 5 decades. The house alone had appreciated significantly. There were investments, savings, property, nothing extravagant. Just the result of a lifetime of discipline and hard work. The more I thought about it, the more certain patterns began to emerge. Whenever finances came up, interest suddenly appeared. Phone calls became more frequent. Conversations became warmer. Questions became more specific. At the time I dismissed it. Now I wasn't so sure. I carefully placed Harold's letter back into the envelope. Then I looked around the study one last time before turning off the lamp. As I headed upstairs, one thought stayed with me. Harold had spent his life protecting this family. Maybe it was finally time for me to protect what he left behind. Even if that meant seeing people for who they truly were. And very soon I would discover exactly how accurate that instinct had become. 3 days after that sleepless night in my study, my phone rang just after lunch. Margaret Lawson, Harold's cousin, 80 years old and still sharper than most people half her age. "Lunch tomorrow," she said. "That's not a question." I laughed. "Then I suppose I'll see you tomorrow." The next afternoon we met at a small diner downtown. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody. The kind of place Harold used to love. After we ordered, Margaret studied me carefully. "You look tired." "I've been sleeping fine." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not what I asked." I smiled. "Some people can see through you no matter how hard you try." For a while we talked about ordinary things. Her garden. Mutual friends. The unusually warm weather. Then she set down her coffee cup. "Now tell me what's really going on." So I did. I told her about the distance growing between me and the children. The family gatherings I wasn't invited to. The phone calls that only came when something was needed. And of course Lisa's words. "Be glad we even let you visit." Margaret listened quietly. When I finished, she didn't look surprised. That bothered me. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I asked. She sighed. "Because I've been wondering when you'd finally notice." A chill ran through me. "Notice what?" Margaret hesitated. Then she leaned forward. "A few weeks ago, I was at the country club charity luncheon." I nodded. Several families from town attended those events. One of the women there was talking about real estate. She paused. Normally I wouldn't pay attention. Something in her voice made me sit straighter. But then I heard your name. The diner suddenly felt much quieter. "My name?" Margaret nodded. "The woman said she had recently spoken with someone from your family." I felt my stomach tighten. "What did she say?" Margaret looked uncomfortable. "As best I remember." She took a slow breath. "The conversation was about what would happen to your house someday." For a moment I simply stared at her. My house. She nodded again. The way they were talking. She said carefully. It sounded less like concern and more like planning. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I looked down at my coffee. Harold and I had spent 46 years building that home. Every room carried memories. Every wall held part of our story. The thought of people casually discussing its future without me felt strangely unsettling. Who exactly was talking? I asked. Margaret shook her head. I don't know. I only heard pieces of the conversation. Then she added something that hit even harder. But whoever it was sounded very confident. Confident. That word stayed with me. Not hopeful. Not uncertain. Confident. As though the outcome had already been decided. Margaret reached across the table. Eleanor, I'm not telling you this to upset you. I know. I'm telling you because Harold used to worry about something. I looked up. What? That people might someday become more interested in what you own than in how you were doing. The sentence landed heavily between us. Because lately it felt true. Painfully true. For years I had dismissed every warning sign. Every uncomfortable feeling. Every small disappointment. I always found an explanation. I always gave the benefit of the doubt. But sitting there across from Margaret, I realized something. The problem wasn't one comment. Or one missed invitation. Or one forgotten phone call. The problem was a pattern. Pattern that stretched back years. Margaret squeezed my hand. Just pay attention. To what? To what people ask about. I frowned. She continued. When someone calls, notice whether they're asking about you. He said quietly. Or whether they're asking about what belongs to you. The drive home felt different. Not because I had discovered some shocking secret. Because for the first time I stopped looking at my family through old memories. I started looking at them as they were. And once I did that, certain questions became impossible to ignore. Questions about the house. Questions about my finances. Questions about the future. Questions that suddenly seemed much more important than I had realized. At the time I still hoped I was wrong. I still hoped there was a reasonable explanation for everything. But deep down something had already changed. For the first time I wasn't just listening to what my children said. I was beginning to watch what they did. And that decision would reveal more than I was prepared to see. After my lunch with Margaret I stopped chasing people. That may not sound like much. But for me it changed everything. For years I had been the one making the calls. Sending the invitations. Remembering birthdays. Organizing holiday dinners. Checking in when someone was sick. Reaching out whenever silence stretched too long. I told myself I was keeping the family connected. Maybe I was. But I was also carrying a relationship that nobody else seemed interested in carrying with me. So I stopped. Not out of anger. Not to teach anyone a lesson. I simply wanted to see what would happen. The first week was quiet. Very quiet. No phone calls. No visits. No messages asking how I was doing. Part of me still expected someone to notice. Someone to call and ask if everything was all right. Nobody did. One evening I sat on the back porch where Harold and I used to spend our summers. The sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange and pink across the Iowa horizon. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. I remembered how Harold would sit beside me and point out shapes in the clouds. Simple moments. Nothing expensive. Nothing impressive. Yet somehow they became the memories that lasted longest. My phone buzzed. For a moment I felt a small spark of hope. Maybe it was Brian. Maybe Lisa. Instead it was a text message. From Brian. I opened it. Hey Mom. Any chance you could help Ethan with his summer camp fees? Things are a little tight right now. I stared at the screen. That was the first message I had received from him in nearly 3 weeks. No hello. No how are you? No mention of our last conversation. Just money. I set the phone down. For the first time in my life I didn't answer immediately. The next morning another message arrived. This time from Lisa. Mom. Do you still have the contractor's number you used for your roof? Again no greeting. No interest in my life. Only a request. I began noticing a pattern I had ignored for years. The conversations always started when something was needed. The warmth appeared when assistance was required. Then disappeared afterward. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Several days later, I received an unexpected invitation. Lisa called. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Mom, we're having a barbecue this Saturday. You should come." The invitation surprised me. Not because it happened, because it came so suddenly. After weeks of silence. "That sounds nice," I replied. "What time?" She hesitated briefly. "Around 2. I agreed to come. Then I waited. Something felt different. Saturday arrived warm and sunny. I baked a peach cobbler that morning. One of Brian's favorites since childhood. Old habits again. When I arrived at Lisa's house, several cars were already parked outside. Family members filled the backyard. Children ran across the grass. People laughed around picnic tables. At first glance, everything looked normal. But after Margaret's warning, I paid closer attention. And once again I started noticing things. Conversations would pause when I approached, then quickly change subjects. People exchanged brief looks. Small looks. Easy to miss. Unless you were watching for them. At one point I stepped inside to refill my glass of iced tea. As I walked through the kitchen, I heard voices coming from the dining room. The door wasn't completely closed. I recognized Brian's voice immediately. "Well, eventually we'll have to figure something out." Then another voice. "Lisa's." "I know. But we can't keep putting it off forever." I stopped. Not because I wanted to eavesdrop. Because hearing your own children speak in hushed voices has a way of getting your attention. Before I could hear more, someone entered the kitchen. The conversation ended instantly. A few minutes later, both Brian and Lisa appeared smiling. Almost too quickly. Almost too carefully. That evening as I drove home, I replayed the day in my mind. The strange pauses. The glances. The unfinished conversation. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. For years I would have dismissed it. I would have invented explanations. Protected them from suspicion. Protected myself from disappointment. Not anymore. The following Monday I did something I had been avoiding. I called Harold's longtime attorney. His name was Robert Henderson. He had handled our estate planning for nearly 20 years. We scheduled a meeting for later that week. I didn't tell Brian. I didn't tell Lisa. I didn't tell anyone. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishment. It was about understanding exactly where things stood. And for the first time in a very long while, I intended to look at the facts instead of my feelings. As I hung up the phone, I glanced at Harold's photograph sitting on the bookshelf. His familiar smile stared back at me. For some reason I felt calmer. Stronger. Almost as if he were reminding me of something he used to say whenever life became complicated. "Don't rush. Pay attention." That was exactly what I planned to do. Because the more attention I paid, the more certain I became that something was happening behind the scenes. And before long I was finally going to discover what it was. The meeting with Robert Henderson was scheduled for Thursday morning. For the next 3 days I said nothing to anyone. I didn't call Brian. I didn't call Lisa. I didn't mention my concerns to friends. I simply watched. Sometimes silence tells you more than questions ever can. Thursday arrived bright and clear. I drove into town early and parked outside Robert's office. The building hadn't changed in years. The same brick exterior. The same neatly trimmed shrubs. The same brass plaque beside the entrance. Walking inside felt strangely familiar. Harold and I had spent countless afternoons there reviewing paperwork, updating plans, and making decisions about our future. Back then, it seemed like something we would always have time to do together. Life has a way of proving you wrong. Robert greeted me warmly. He was older now. More gray hair. A few more wrinkles. But his handshake remained firm. "It's good to see you, Eleanor." That was another thing I liked about Robert. He always spoke to me as if my opinions mattered. Not as someone's mother. Not as someone's widow. As me. We settled into his office and spent a few minutes catching up. Then his expression became professional. "What can I help you with?" I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust him. Because saying things out loud somehow made them more real. Finally, I told him the truth. The distance. The strange behavior. The comments. The retirement community brochure. The growing feeling that something wasn't right. Robert listened carefully. When I finished, he folded his hands. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Have your children been asking more questions about your finances recently? The answer came immediately. Yes. His expression didn't change. That concerned me more than if it had. I thought back over the last 2 years. Questions about the value of the house. Questions about insurance. Questions about investments. Questions about whether I had updated my will. At the time they seemed harmless. Now they felt different. Robert opened a folder. Eleanor, I want to be very clear about something. I nodded. Everything belongs to you. Simple words. Yet hearing them brought unexpected relief. The house. The savings. The investments Harold and I had spent decades building. All of it remained completely under my control. No one could make decisions for me. No one could pressure me into changes. No one had any authority over my future. For the first time in weeks, I felt myself breathe easier. Then Robert added something else. Which means you should never feel rushed. Those words stayed with me. Never feel rushed. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Before leaving, I asked him not to mention our conversation to anyone. He assured me he wouldn't. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about control. For years, I had slowly surrendered pieces of it. Not legally. Emotionally. I allowed other people to determine my value. Their invitations determined my happiness. Their attention determined my sense of belonging. Their approval determined my peace. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten something important. My life still belonged to me. That realization felt powerful. The following weekend brought another opportunity to observe. This time it came unexpectedly. Brian called. Actually called. The first real phone call in over a month. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Hey Mom. Hello Brian. We should get together soon. I waited. Years of motherhood had taught me patience. Sure enough, the reason arrived. I've been thinking about your house. There it was. Not how are you? Not how have you been feeling? The house. I listened quietly. Brian continued. You know, maintaining a place that size has to be difficult. Interesting. The exact same concern Lisa had expressed nearly a year earlier. At the time I thought she was being thoughtful. Now I wasn't so sure. It's manageable, I replied. A brief silence followed. Then he laughed awkwardly. Well, just thinking. Ahead. Thinking ahead. That phrase echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. 2 days later Lisa called. Another unusual event. After a few minutes of small talk, she casually asked whether I had considered downsizing. The similarity was impossible to ignore. The same topic. The same timing. The same concern. Almost as if the conversations had been rehearsed. That evening I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The sky burned with shades of gold and crimson. Beautiful. Peaceful. And yet my thoughts refused to settle. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even shocked anymore. I was becoming certain. Certain that conversations were taking place without me. Certain that plans were being discussed. Certain that my future was somehow part of those plans. The question was why. Then 3 days later the answer began to reveal itself. Margaret called again. Her voice sounded unusually serious. Eleanor. What is it? You need to know something. I sat up straighter. What happened? There was a pause. Then she spoke. I ran into someone yesterday who knows your daughter. My heart tightened. And Margaret took a slow breath. Eleanor. They've been talking as if your house already belongs to them. The world seemed to go completely silent. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Because deep down I had suspected something like this. But hearing it confirmed by someone else was different. Much different. And at that moment I realized this wasn't just about being excluded anymore. It was about being counted out. Long before I was gone. And that realization changed everything. For a long time after Margaret's phone call, I sat alone on the porch. The evening air had turned cooler. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. A car passed slowly down the street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinari moments. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. They've been talking as if your house already belongs to them. The sentence replayed over and over inside my head. Not because I was shocked. The signs had been there for months. Maybe even years. What hurt wasn't the possibility that they wanted the house. What hurt was realizing they seemed more interested in what I owned than in who I was. I thought about calling Brian. I thought about calling Lisa. I imagined asking direct questions, demanding explanations, forcing a conversation. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. People tell you the truth long before they say it out loud. They tell you through their actions. And my children had been telling me the truth for years. I simply hadn't wanted to hear it. The following morning, I woke up with an unusual sense of calm. Not happiness. Not relief. Acceptance. The kind that comes after fighting reality for too long. For the first time in years, I stopped asking how to fix my relationship with my children. Instead, I asked myself a different question. What did I want the rest of my life to look like? The question surprised me, because somewhere along the way I had stopped thinking about my own future. Everything had revolved around my family, their schedules, their needs, their problems, their approval. Without realizing it, I had made them the center of a life they barely participated in. That week, I decided to do something different, something just for myself. On Wednesday morning, I drove to the community center downtown. A banner outside advertised a senior volunteer program. I had seen it before, dozens of times, but I had always been too busy waiting for family phone calls, too busy hoping someone would visit, too busy sitting at home feeling disappointed. Inside, I met people from all walks of life. Retired teachers, former nurses, veterans, small business owners, widows, widowers, people who had lived entire lives before I ever met them. For the first time in a long while, nobody saw me as someone's mother. Nobody saw me as someone's grandmother. Nobody cared about my house. Nobody asked about inheritance. They simply treated me like Eleanor. And strangely enough, I had almost forgotten what that felt like. Over the next few weeks, I became involved in several programs. I helped organize book donations, participated in local events, read stories to children at the public library. Simple things. Meaningful things. The more time I spent there, the less time I spent staring at my phone, waiting, hoping, feeling rejected. One afternoon, while helping sort donated books, I met a woman named Patricia. She was 75, sharp-witted, funny, fearlessly honest. By the end of our first conversation, I felt as though I had known her for years. A few days later, we had lunch together. As often happens among older people, our conversation eventually turned toward family. Patricia listened quietly while I shared pieces of my story. Not everything. Just enough. When I finished, she smiled sadly. "You're not the first." "What do you mean?" She stirred her coffee. "I know more people worried about disappointing their children than I know children worried about disappointing their parents." The truth of that statement settled heavily between us. Then she said something else. Something I never forgot. Never build your final years around people who only show up when it's convenient. I thought about that sentence all the way home, because it described my life perfectly. For years I had been waiting for invitations, waiting for attention, waiting for scraps of affection. Meanwhile, life had continued moving forward without me. I didn't want that anymore. One Saturday morning, I stood in my backyard looking at the garden herald and I had planted years earlier. The roses were blooming. The bird feeder was crowded. The maple tree we planted when Brian graduated high school stood tall against the blue sky. For the first time in a very long time, I felt grateful. Not for my children. Not for my possessions. For my freedom. The freedom to choose how I spent my remaining years. The freedom to decide who deserved access to my time. The freedom to stop living as if I needed permission to matter. That realization changed me. People often assume strength arrives with anger. Doesn't. Sometimes strength arrives quietly, without drama, without announcements. It simply settles into your heart and refuses to leave. And once it does, everything begins to look different, including the plans you make for the future, especially the plans you make for what will happen after you're gone. Because while I was rebuilding my life, someone else was still making assumptions about my assets. Assumptions that would soon become very expensive mistakes. I didn't know it yet, but the most important meeting of my life was only a few days away. The meeting took place on a Tuesday morning. A quiet Tuesday. The kind of ordinary day that never seems important while you're living it. Yet looking back, I realized that morning changed the course of everything that followed. I arrived at Robert Henderson's office carrying a folder Harold had assembled years earlier. The same brown folder I had looked through in my study. The same folder filled with decades of careful planning. As I sat across from Robert, I felt surprisingly calm. Not nervous. Not emotional. Just certain. For months, maybe even years, I had been reacting to other people's choices. Other people's behavior. Other people's expectations. This was the first decision that belonged entirely to me. Robert adjusted his glasses and reviewed the documents. Then he looked up. Have you decided what you want to do? The answer came easier than I expected. Yes. For a moment I thought about Brian. I thought about Lisa. I thought about every birthday party I attended. Every school event. Every sleepless night spent worrying about them. Every sacrifice Harold and I made. None of that disappeared. I still loved my children. That wasn't the issue. Love and trust are not the same thing. I had finally learned that lesson. What matters most to you? Robert asked. The question lingered in the room. A year earlier I probably would have answered differently. A year earlier I would have focused entirely on family. Now something had changed. I want what Harold and I built to help people who truly value it. Robert nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what I meant. Over the following hour we discussed options. Scholarship funds. Community programs. Local charities. Educational grants. Youth literacy projects. Veteran support organizations. The possibilities were endless. And for the first time in a very long while I felt excited. Not because I was taking something away from anyone. Because I was giving something meaningful a future. When the meeting ended, several documents required updating. Nothing happened immediately, but the process had begun, and only Robert and I knew about it. Driving home, I rolled down the windows and let the warm summer air fill the car. For months I had carried a weight inside me, a constant sadness, a constant disappointment. Now some of that weight was gone, not because my children had changed, because I had. A few days later, another interesting thing happened. Brian called. Again. The second call in less than 2 weeks. That alone was unusual. Hey Mom, he said. His voice sounded cheerful. Almost overly cheerful. We talked about the weather. The grandchildren. Local news. Then, eventually, the conversation drifted toward real estate. I almost smiled. The pattern was becoming predictable. I heard property values in your neighborhood have gone up again. There it was. Casual. Harmless. At least on the surface. So I've heard, I replied. That's great. A brief pause followed. Then another question. Have you ever thought about selling? I looked out my kitchen window. The maple tree Harold planted years ago swayed gently in the breeze. No. Another pause. Longer this time. Just curious. Of course he was. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. Not hurt. Not angry. Simply observing. The more I paid attention, the more obvious things became. A few days later, Lisa stopped by unexpectedly. That was unusual too. She brought coffee, asked about my health, complimented the garden. The visit felt strangely rehearsed, as if she were checking a box. Halfway through the conversation, she casually asked whether I had updated any legal documents recently. The question nearly made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was so transparent. I answered honestly, yes. Her eyes brightened immediately. What changed? I smiled. Nothing you need to worry about. The expression on her face lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Disappointment. Real disappointment. Then it vanished, replaced by a polite smile. That moment told me more than any argument ever could. Weeks passed. Life continued. I spent more time volunteering, more time with friends, more time building a life that no longer depended on my children's attention. The remarkable thing was how much happier I became. For years I had assumed happiness required family closeness. Now I understood something different. Peace begins when you stop begging people to value you. One evening, while helping organize a literacy fundraiser at the community center, I watched a group of children receiving books they otherwise couldn't afford. Their excitement was genuine. Their gratitude immediate. Standing there, I suddenly understood exactly where I wanted much of my estate to go. Not toward entitlement, toward opportunity, not toward expectation, toward purpose. By the end of that week, several major decisions had been finalized. Quietly, legally, permanently. No announcements, no confrontations, no dramatic speeches. Just signatures, paperwork, and certainty. Meanwhile, Brian and Lisa continued making plans based on assumptions. Assumptions about a future they believed was guaranteed. What they didn't realize was that the future they were counting on was disappearing one document at a time. And very soon they were going to discover exactly how wrong they had been. The first sign appeared almost a month after my meeting with Robert. By then, most of the paperwork had already been completed. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. I spent my mornings volunteering, paid attention to local real estate. So that's how they found out. Probably. After we hung up, everything suddenly made more sense. The phone calls, the extra attention, the sudden interest. News had reached Brian and Lisa, and now they were trying to understand what it meant. 3 days later, Brian invited me to lunch. That alone was unusual. For years, our conversations had mostly happened over the phone. Now he wanted to meet in person. We sat at a restaurant near the river. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation stayed pleasant. The grandchildren, sports, weather, community events. Then Brian casually asked, "How have you been spending your time lately?" The question sounded harmless, but I noticed something. He wasn't really listening to my answer. His mind seemed somewhere else. A few minutes later, he asked another question. "Still meeting with Robert Henderson?" There it was. I took a sip of iced tea. Occasionally. Brian nodded, trying to appear relaxed, trying a little too hard. Then he smiled. "You know, Dad always trusted Robert." I smiled back. Yes, he did. The subject changed, but not for long. Before lunch ended, Brian somehow found his way back to finances twice more. Not directly, never directly, but enough for me to notice, enough for me to understand. The lunch wasn't about reconnecting. It was an investigation. Polite one, but an investigation nonetheless. The following week, Lisa stopped by. Coffee in hand. Warm smile. Unexpected visit. Pattern was emerging. We sat in the kitchen. She complimented the garden. Asked about my volunteer work. Talked about the grandchildren. Then eventually she asked, "Have you thought about simplifying things?" I looked at her. What things? The property. There it was again. Not my health. Not my happiness. The property. I answered carefully. "I've thought about many things lately." Lisa smiled, but something about it felt forced. For years I would have ignored details like that. Now I paid attention. As the weeks passed, the attention from both children increased. More invitations. More visits. More phone calls. More concern. At first glance, it looked like they were trying to rebuild our relationship. Maybe part of them genuinely was. I want to believe that. But another part seemed driven by uncertainty. For the first time, they realized they didn't fully understand my plans. And uncertainty made them uncomfortable. One Saturday evening, while attending a family barbecue, I quietly watched everyone interact. The conversations, the smiles, the small moments. And suddenly I understood something. For years, I had mistaken access for connection. Being invited somewhere didn't mean being valued. Being included didn't mean being appreciated. Real love doesn't appear only when circumstances change. Real love is consistent. That realization settled over me like a blanket. Calm, certain, permanent. Because by then the decisions had already been made. The paperwork had already been signed. And neither Brian nor Lisa understood how much had changed. Not yet, but very soon they would. And when that moment arrived, there would be no confusion about why. The confrontation happened 2 weeks later. Ironically, it began with an invitation. A family dinner. At my house. Brian called personally. His voice sounded unusually careful. "Mom, I think we should all get together." I knew immediately. They had found out something. Maybe not everything, but enough. "That sounds fine," I said. "What time?" 6. The moment I hung up, I walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the backyard Harold and I had built together. For a few minutes I simply stood there. Calm. Completely calm. Because I already knew how the evening would end. The only thing I didn't know was how long it would take them to get there. At exactly 6 o'clock the doorbell rang. Then another. Then another. Soon the house was full. Brian, Lisa, their spouses, even a few older grandchildren. Everyone seemed unusually serious. Nobody lingered over small talk. Nobody seemed interested in dinner. That alone told me everything. The food sat untouched. The room felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Finally Brian cleared his throat. Mom. I looked up. Yes. He exchanged a glance with Lisa. Then he spoke. We need to talk. There it was. The sentence people always use before saying something they don't want to say. I nodded. Go ahead. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Lisa finally stepped in. We heard you've been making changes. I waited. She continued. Changes to your finances. Not your life. Not your plans. Your finances. The wording mattered. I noticed it immediately. Brian leaned forward. We're worried. That almost made me smile. For years they hadn't worried when I sat alone during holidays. They hadn't worried when weeks passed without a phone call. They hadn't worried when their mother became a guest in her own family. Now suddenly they were worried. Interesting. Worried about what? I asked. Another uncomfortable silence. Finally Brian answered. You've been selling assets. One asset. But what if you keep going? There it was. Not concern. Fear. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of losing something they believed already belonged to them. I folded my hands calmly on the table. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Then Lisa said something that surprised even me. We always assumed everything would stay in the family. The honesty caught everyone off guard. Even her husband looked uncomfortable. Because for the first time all evening someone had spoken the truth. I nodded slowly. You assumed. Neither of them responded. The room grew quiet. Then Brian sighed. Mom, that's not fair. I looked at him. The same boy whose scraped knees I once bandaged. The same boy Harold taught to ride a bicycle. The same boy I spent decades protecting. What's not fair? His voice rose slightly. You're changing things without talking to us. For a brief moment I simply stared at him. Then I asked a question. When was the last time either of you asked what I wanted? The room went silent. Nobody answered. Because nobody could. I continued. When was the last time you invited me somewhere because you enjoyed my company? Still silence. When was the last time you called just to hear my voice? Brian looked down. Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The truth is difficult when it has nowhere to hide. For years I had imagined this conversation. I thought I would be angry. Thought I would cry. Thought I would list every hurt. And every disappointment. Instead I felt peaceful. The pain had already happened. This was simply recognition. Finally Lisa spoke. We've been busy. The old excuse. The familiar excuse. The excuse that had covered years of neglect. I nodded. Yes. You have. Then I leaned back in my chair. And for the first time I repeated the sentence that had changed everything. The sentence neither of them expected to hear. Be glad we even let you visit. The color immediately drained from Lisa's face. Brian froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room became completely silent. Because they remembered. Of course they remembered. Some words never leave a person's heart. I looked directly at them. Do you know what hurt most? Neither answered. It wasn't being excluded. My voice remained calm. It wasn't the missed birthdays. The forgotten invitations. The unanswered phone calls. I paused. It was realizing that my value to you seemed connected to what I owned. Brian immediately shook his head. That's not true. But his voice lacked conviction. Because deep down he wasn't entirely sure anymore. And neither was I. I stood slowly and walked toward the window. The sun was beginning to set outside. Golden light filled the room. For a moment I thought about Harold. What he would say. What he would do. Then I turned back toward my family. I loved you enough to give you my whole life. The room remained silent. But I will not spend the rest of it begging to be valued. No one argued. No one interrupted. Because there was nothing left to argue about. The truth was finally sitting at the table with all of us. And everyone could see it. What they didn't yet know was just how final my decisions had become. That revelation was still waiting. And it would arrive very soon. The final conversation happened 3 months after that family dinner. Not because I arranged it. Because Brian and Lisa requested it. By then, life had become surprisingly peaceful. I spent my mornings at the community center. My afternoons in the garden. My evenings reading on the porch Harold loved so much. For the first time in years, my happiness no longer depended on who called. Or who didn't. Then one Tuesday afternoon my phone rang. It was Brian. "Mom, can we come by?" His voice sounded different. Tired. Uncertain. I knew why. A few days earlier, Robert had finalized the last remaining documents. Everything was complete. Every decision. Every instruction. Every distribution. There was nothing left to change. "Of course," I said. That evening, Brian and Lisa arrived together. Neither brought coffee. Neither brought pastries. Neither tried to make small talk. They sat across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where Harold and I had spent decades raising them. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Brian finally broke the silence. Robert explained everything. I nodded. Yes. Lisa looked down at her hands. Her eyes were red. As if she hadn't slept much. For years I would have rushed to comfort her. This time I waited. Eventually she asked the question they had both come to ask. Why? Not angry. Not demanding. Just confused. I looked around the room. The family photographs. The grandfather clock. Harold's empty chair. Pieces of a life built one day at a time. Then I answered honestly. Because I wanted what your father and I built to reflect our values. Neither interrupted. So I continued. A large portion of the estate will fund literacy programs. Lisa blinked. I continued. Another portion will support scholarships for students who need help. Brian stared quietly at the table. And part of it will help local senior programs remain available for people who don't have family support. The room remained silent. Finally Brian looked up. And us. I met his eyes. There was sadness there. But something else too. Understanding. Perhaps for the first time. You still received something. Both of them looked surprised. I had never intended to leave them with nothing. That was never the goal. But not what you expected. Neither argued. Because they already knew. The numbers no longer mattered. The message did. 4 years they assumed the future had already been decided. That assumption had cost them more than money. It had cost them perspective. Lisa wiped her eyes. Then she asked a question I will never forget. When did you decide? I thought about that. The answer wasn't the meeting with Robert. Or the paperwork. Or the sale of the Oak Ridge property. The decision happened much earlier. I think it started the day you told me I should be grateful just to visit. The room became completely still. Lisa closed her eyes. Brian looked away. No excuses came this time. No explanations. No arguments. Just silence. The kind of silence that appears when the truth finally arrives. A few minutes later, Lisa quietly whispered, I'm sorry. I believed she meant it. Not because of the inheritance. Because for the first time she understood the wound. Brian nodded. So am I. I smiled gently. I know. And surprisingly I did. Not everything can be repaired. Not every hurt disappears. But people can learn. People can change. The conversation lasted another hour. For the first time in years we talked honestly. Not about property. Not about money. Not about legal documents. About family. About mistakes. About regret. About time. When they finally left, I walked them to the front door. Just as I had done hundreds of times before. Except this time felt different. No expectations. No resentment. No unfinished questions. Only clarity. As their car disappeared down the street, I looked toward the sunset. The sky glowed gold above the maple tree Harold planted years ago. And suddenly I thought about something he once told me. The true measure of an inheritance isn't what people receive. It's what they learn. For a long time I never understood what he meant. Now I did. The money would eventually be spent. The property would eventually belong to someone else. The investments would eventually disappear. But the lesson would remain. Love should never be treated as an obligation. Respect should never be postponed. And parents should never have to earn a place in the family they helped build. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the stars appear one by one. The house felt peaceful. The future felt peaceful. And for the first time in many years, so did I. Because the day my children told me, "Be glad we even let you visit," they believed they were defining my value. What they didn't realize was that they were defining their own. And in the end, that made all the difference. The end.